For years, Sophia and Kuba had been inseparable. From the moment they met, it was as if something ancient, something unexplainable, connected them. Some called it a miracle, others called it fate. Sophia never questioned it. She simply felt it, deep in her soul. It started when Kuba was just a frightened, orphaned infant, barely strong enough to hold on to life. He had been rescued from poachers, his tiny body weak, his dark eyes filled with fear. The first time Sophia reached out to him, he hesitated, uncertain, until his trembling fingers curled around hers. In that instant, something passed between them, an unspoken promise. She would never let him feel alone again. He clung to her, not just for warmth, but for something far greater: trust. As the years passed, their bond only grew stronger. Kuba learned the sound of her voice, the rhythm of her laughter, the warmth of her presence. She would sit by his enclosure for hours, speaking softly, reading to him, sharing the details of her day as if he were an old friend. And maybe, in a way, he was. He responded in ways that defied expectations, tilting his head when she was sad, pressing his forehead against hers in moments of silence. And then there was the signing. When Kuba first signed friend, Sophia had felt her breath catch. The world saw him as an animal, but she saw something more, a soul mirroring hers, a mind that understood far more than anyone realized. Many tried to rationalize it. Some called it conditioning, a learned response from years of interaction. Scientists debated whether Kuba's emotions were real or merely instinct. But Sophia never needed proof, never needed studies or research papers to validate what she already knew in her heart. This was not a bond built on training or habit. It was something deeper, something neither of them could explain, but both of them could feel. In a world that struggled to understand, they had found each other. And for Sophia, that was all that mattered. Sophia still remembered the first time she saw Kuba. He was just a tiny, fragile creature, no more than a few months old, curled up in a corner of the rescue center. His small body trembled, his wide, fearful eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. He had lost everything: his mother, his family, the safety of the dense jungle he once called home. Poachers had taken him, ripped him from his world, leaving only fear and loneliness in its place. She knelt beside his enclosure, speaking in soft tones, unsure if he could understand, but hoping he could feel that he was safe. At first, he didn't move. He didn't cry. He just stared. But then, slowly, hesitantly, he reached out. His tiny fingers wrapped around hers, gripping as if she were the last solid thing in a world that had been torn apart. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, an invisible thread that neither time nor distance could ever break. The days turned into weeks, and Kuba began to trust her. She would sit with him for hours, whispering stories, humming lullabies, just being there. At night, when the other researchers left, she stayed. She would lay outside his enclosure, listening to his soft breathing, letting him know he wasn't alone. He followed her with his eyes, watching her every move, studying her the same way she studied him. And then, one evening, he did something that changed everything. She had been talking absent-mindedly, telling him about the day's work, when he reached out, his small hand pressing against her cheek. It was a moment so brief, so delicate, that it could have been missed. But Sophia felt it, a connection deeper than words, deeper than logic. She placed her hand over his, her heart pounding. As the years passed, Kuba grew, and so did their bond. He wasn't just another gorilla in the sanctuary. He was different, smarter, more aware. He learned to recognize her emotions, to respond in ways that astonished even the most experienced researchers. If she was sad, he would sit close, watching her intently, sometimes nudging her hand as if to ask what was wrong. When she laughed, he grunted in amusement, as if he understood the joke. And then came the moment that solidified everything. Sophia had been teaching him basic sign language, never expecting much. Most gorillas learned a few words: food, play, stop. But one day, as she was preparing to leave, he lifted his massive hands and signed a single word: stay. Her breath caught. She turned, unsure if she had seen it correctly. But there it was again. Stay. It wasn't just a command or a learned response. It was a plea, a need, a feeling he had no other way to express. She dropped to her knees, her vision blurred with unshed tears, and signed back, always. From that moment on, there was no denying it. Kuba wasn't just an animal. He was something more. And to Sophia, he wasn't just a research subject. He was family. Sophia sat cross-legged outside Kuba's enclosure, watching as he carefully peeled a banana with the patience of a child. His massive fingers worked with surprising gentleness, his dark eyes flickering toward her every few seconds, as if to make sure she was still there. She smiled, resting her chin in her palm. "You're taking your time today," she teased. Kuba paused, then smirked in his own way, his lips parting slightly, a low, amused grunt escaping his throat. She knew that look. He was playing with her. Without warning, he extended the banana toward her, offering her a bite. Sophia chuckled and shook her head. "No, that's yours, big guy." But he insisted, pushing it forward until she took the tiniest nibble just to make him happy. It wasn't just a game. It was a ritual, a silent exchange of trust. The world saw him as an animal, a research subject, a creature bound by instinct. But Sophia knew better. She saw the way he studied her, the way he noticed every shift in her mood. On the days she was exhausted, he would sit quietly beside her, mirroring her stillness. On the days she was sad, he would touch her hand, his eyes searching hers as if asking what was wrong. And then there were the days when he was the one who needed her. She would never forget the first time she saw him grieving. It had been after one of the older gorillas, a mother figure in the sanctuary, had passed away. The others moved on quickly, but not Kuba. He sat in the corner of his enclosure, his shoulders slumped, refusing to eat, refusing to respond. Sophia had knelt beside him, unsure of what to do. "I'm here," she whispered, pressing her hand to the glass that separated them. For a long moment, he didn't move. But then, slowly, he lifted his own hand, placing it against hers on the other side. They stayed like that, two souls connected through the cold barrier, sharing a grief that needed no words. She saw it then, clearer than ever. He wasn't just intelligent, he felt, he loved, and somehow, in ways she couldn't explain, he understood her as deeply as she understood him. Some people searched their whole lives for a connection like this, and she had found it in the most unexpected place. Others dismissed it, calling it anthropomorphism, saying she was only projecting human emotions onto an animal. But they didn't see what she saw. They didn't know what it felt like when he reached for her hand, when he leaned his forehead against hers in a silent gesture of comfort, when he signed "friend" and meant it. The sanctuary staff often marveled at their relationship, sometimes watching from a distance with curiosity, sometimes with concern. "You know he's still a wild animal," they reminded her, but Sophia didn't need reminding. She knew exactly what he was. He was Kuba. He was her friend, her family, her kindred spirit in a form the world wasn't ready to understand. And deep down, she knew that no matter what, they would always find their way back to each other. Sophia could feel the tension in the air before anyone said a word. She had seen the worried glances from the sanctuary staff, the hushed conversations behind closed doors. But nothing could have prepared her for the moment they told her the decision had been made. Kuba was being relocated. She felt the air leave her lungs, her mind struggling to process the words. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You can't do this." But their expressions remained firm, unmoving. The sanctuary was running out of funding, and Kuba had been chosen to be transferred to a breeding program in a distant zoo. It wasn't up for debate. It wasn't something she could stop. The words felt like a cruel joke. For years, she had fought to give him a life that was more than just captivity. She had taught him, loved him, connected with him in a way no one else had. And now, they wanted to take him away, to place him in a sterile enclosure, surrounded by strangers who wouldn't understand him the way she did. "You don't understand," she argued, her voice trembling. "Kuba isn't just another gorilla. He's different. He won't survive this." But her protests were met with apologetic nods and empty reassurances. She spent that night sitting by his enclosure, watching him as he slept, his massive chest rising and falling with each slow breath. How could she tell him? How could she explain that soon? She wouldn't be there when he woke up. The thought made her chest tighten. She reached through the bars, brushing her fingers lightly against his arm. He stirred, his deep eyes opening sleepily to meet hers. For a moment, there was only silence, a stillness heavy with unspoken words. Then, as if sensing her distress, he lifted his hand and signed one simple word. "Friend?" Her throat tightened. She forced a smile, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill. "Always," she whispered. But she knew the truth. In a matter of days, he would be gone. The morning of the transfer arrived too soon. The sanctuary staff moved quickly, trying to keep the process efficient, but nothing about it felt right. Kuba was agitated, his sharp eyes darting between the unfamiliar handlers and the large transport crate waiting outside his enclosure. He didn't understand, not yet, but he knew something was wrong. When Sophia stepped forward, he immediately reached for her, his powerful arms stretching through the bars, desperate to hold on to her. "It's okay," she said, her voice cracking. "You're okay." But she was lying. The moment they tried to lead him away, he resisted. His deep, rumbling vocalizations turned into distressed grunts, his muscles tensing. And then, in a heartbreaking moment of clarity, he signed two words that shattered her. "Stay, please." Sophia felt herself break. She wanted to fight, to scream, to stop them from taking him away, but there was nothing she could do. They sedated him to make the transport easier, his powerful body growing sluggish as his eyelids drooped. His last movement before losing consciousness was reaching for her one last time. As they loaded him onto the truck, she pressed her hand against the glass window of the transport crate, whispering the only thing she could manage. "I love you, Kuba." And then, he was gone. The days after Kuba's departure felt hollow, as if a part of Sophia had been ripped away. The sanctuary was quieter now, but not in a peaceful way. More like something was missing, something vital. She still caught herself glancing toward his enclosure, expecting to see his familiar figure watching her, waiting for their daily routine. But he wasn't there. And every time that realization hit, it felt like a fresh wound reopening. She tried to convince herself that he was okay, that he was adjusting, but deep down, an unease settled in her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. Weeks passed, and updates about Kuba were scarce. The sanctuary received reports that he had arrived safely, that he was eating, that he was healthy. But Sophia knew that health was more than just physical. She needed to see him, to know that he was truly okay. After endless pleading, she finally got approval to visit him. The moment she stepped into the zoo, her stomach twisted. The space felt sterile, unnatural. It wasn't the lush greenery he had once known, the place where he had felt free despite the barriers. Here, everything was controlled, calculated. And then, she saw him. Kuba sat in the farthest corner of the enclosure, his massive body hunched, his expression vacant. He wasn't playing, he wasn't signing, he wasn't himself. Her heart clenched at the sight. She called his name, her voice breaking through the murmur of the visitors. He didn't react at first, as if the sound barely registered. But then, slowly, his head lifted. Their eyes met. For a second, there was nothing, just silence. Then recognition flickered in his dark, tired gaze. He moved, sluggish at first, then with urgency, his hands pressing against the glass that separated them. Tears welled in Sophia's eyes as she pressed her palms against the barrier, wishing it would disappear. "I'm here," she whispered. Kuba lifted his hand and signed weakly. "Friend?" She nodded rapidly, choking back the sob in her throat. "Always," she signed back. But something was wrong. He looked thinner, his movements slower. This wasn't the strong, playful, intelligent Kuba she had known. It was as if something inside him had dimmed. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. He wasn't thriving. He was surviving. Barely. Sophia knew in that moment that she couldn't leave him there. She wouldn't. No matter what it took, no matter how impossible it seemed, she was going to bring him home. Sophia couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Kuba's empty stare, the way his massive body seemed so small in that cold, sterile enclosure. The image haunted her. She'd spent years fighting for his happiness, for his freedom, and now he was wasting away behind glass. This wasn't the life he deserved. This wasn't what she had promised him. Determined, she spent every waking moment researching, reaching out to conservationists, lawyers, anyone who could help. She pored over legal documents, studied wildlife relocation policies, and contacted activists who had successfully rescued animals from captivity before. Most told her the same thing. It was nearly impossible. Kuba was now considered the property of the zoo, part of a breeding program they weren't willing to part with. It didn't matter that he was suffering. It didn't matter that he was more than just another gorilla to her. To them, he was an asset, a number, a statistic. But Sophia refused to accept that. She started a petition, gathering thousands of signatures from people all over the world who believed Kuba deserved better. She spoke to journalists, shared his story online, did everything she could to make people see what she saw, a soul trapped in a place he didn't belong. The movement grew stronger by the day, but still, the zoo refused to budge. Then, the breaking point came. A leaked video surfaced, footage of Kuba sitting motionless for hours, refusing to eat, barely responding to his keepers. His once powerful frame had grown thinner, his spirit clearly fading. The world finally saw what Sophia had known all along. The pressure mounted, and the zoo could no longer ignore it. After months of relentless fighting, they announced their decision. Kuba would be released back into the care of the sanctuary. The news sent shockwaves through the community. Sophia could hardly believe it. After everything, after all the hopeless nights, all the battles, she had won. He was coming home. But as she prepared for his return, she couldn't help but wonder, was it too late? Would the Kuba she once knew still be there, waiting for her? Or had captivity taken something from him that could never be restored?